It all began with a quiet rumor passed among sailors more than 2 centuries ago. Stories circulated about a ship carrying a treasure so large it seemed unbelievable. A ship that vanished into the unforgiving waters of Lake Michigan, leaving behind nothing but mystery and speculation. For generations, people dismissed it as legend, a story told by old sailors around a fire to keep listeners entertained. Yet, for Rick Lagina, a man who has spent decades chasing historical mysteries, the story was never just a tale. It was a challenge, a puzzle waiting to be solved, and a treasure waiting to be found. According to Rick, the lost ship did not just carry personal belongings or ordinary cargo. It carried nearly $4 million in gold, and if the rumors were true, it could still be lying somewhere beneath the waves, hidden by time, ice, and storms. The first step in this journey was to gather evidence and study every scrap of information that might point to the ship's resting place. Old maps, letters, and reports passed down through families were all examined. Rick and his team devoted countless hours to cross-referencing these sources, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. The goal was to locate the most probable spot where the ship might have sunk. They were not looking for legends or stories. They were looking for proof, something tangible, a sign that would tell them the treasure was real. Every detail mattered: the shape of the shoreline, water currents, storms recorded in history, even the placement of other shipwrecks. All of it contributed to the growing picture of what lay beneath the lake. Finally, the team decided to focus on Poverty Island, a small, desolate landmass in the middle of Lake Michigan. Its name alone suggested danger, a place the lake itself seemed to warn sailors about. For centuries, ships had been lost around this island, making it a graveyard of wooden hulls and twisted metal. Despite the island's quiet appearance, it had a violent history, and it was exactly the kind of location where a ship carrying gold could vanish without a trace. Rick's team equipped themselves with the latest technology, including advanced sonar machines capable of mapping the lake bottom with extreme precision. Their goal was simple but challenging: to locate the ghostly outline of the lost ship and, if possible, the treasure it was rumored to carry. On the first day of the search, the team positioned their boat above the coordinates suggested by historical records. The water was calm, mirroring the sky and making it seem almost peaceful. But beneath that still surface lay decades, maybe even centuries of secrets. The sonar device hummed steadily, scanning the lake floor in slow, methodical sweeps. Shadows and shapes appeared on the screen, most of them ordinary rocks or debris, but the crew studied each one with intensity, looking for anything that might hint at human construction. Hours passed and tension grew. Every flicker on the screen, every shadow moving across the display sent pulses of excitement and anxiety through the team. They knew that at any moment, history could reveal itself in a way no one had seen before. And then it happened. A long, dark shape began to appear on the sonar screen, unlike anything the crew had expected. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding silt. But as the sweeps continued, it became clearer. It was unmistakably the outline of a ship. Hearts raced. This had to be it. The legendary Confederate vessel carrying gold that had been lost all those years ago. But the excitement was quickly replaced with confusion. Directly next to the larger shape, the sonar revealed a smaller outline, partially overlapping the first. 2 wrecks instead of 1. This was unexpected. Historical accounts only spoke of a single ship, yet the evidence suggested a second, smaller vessel might have ended up in the same area, perhaps attempting to recover the treasure and then sinking itself. The implications were staggering. The team realized they were not just hunting a single wreck, they were uncovering a pair of historical tragedies, 2 ships lost decades apart, bound together by misfortune and the lure of gold. Rick and the team immediately began planning the next steps. The first priority was to gather more precise information about the site, to understand the size, orientation, and condition of both wrecks. They knew the lake's currents, ice, and storms could have shifted the debris over time, making it difficult to assess the situation. But with careful mapping, sonar images, and detailed notes, they could create a plan for divers to explore the site.
The site safely. The following day, divers Mike and John prepared for the first descent. Experienced in the cold, murky waters of the Great Lakes, they were familiar with the dangers that lay beneath the surface. Visibility could drop to zero in moments. Sharp metal edges and broken wood could cause serious injury, and the strong currents near Poverty Island could push them off course. Every precaution was taken. Air tanks were double-checked, lights were tested, and communication equipment was verified. The team on the boat held their breath as the divers slipped into the water, leaving the surface calm while descending into darkness hundreds of feet below. As the divers reached the lakebed, their powerful lights cut through the darkness, revealing the first wreck in full detail. It was almost unrecognizable as a ship. The timbers had been broken, the metal twisted, the structure battered by waves and ice over decades. But even in ruin, the outlines of the vessel were clear, and the placement of ballast stones confirmed the era of the ship. This was no ordinary wreck. It was from the right period, likely the Confederate vessel the legend spoke of. Then the divers moved toward the smaller ship. Even more astonishing, it seemed partially draped over the larger wreck, as if fate had intertwined their final moments. The sonar had been correct. There were two wrecks, and both lay tantalizingly close to one another, perfectly positioned to tell a story that had been hidden for centuries. The divers carefully navigated the debris, noting areas that might contain artifacts or evidence of the gold. While some parts of the wrecks were completely destroyed, other sections remained intact, offering hope that parts of the treasure might still be there. Pieces of cargo, equipment, and structural elements were examined and recorded. Every observation was critical, as even small details could reveal the most important locations. The divers had to balance caution with efficiency. One wrong move could destroy fragile evidence or put them in danger. Meanwhile, back on the surface, Rick and the crew monitored every detail from the sonar screens and divers' audio feed. The tension was almost unbearable. Every word, every description, every signal mattered. They knew that the gold might not be visible, that it might be buried under debris or silt, but each step brought them closer to the truth. The story they were chasing had been whispered for over 200 years, and now it was coming alive in front of them. The combination of historical research, advanced technology, and careful exploration was revealing a narrative that had been forgotten by time. As the divers moved carefully through the wreckage, every step seemed to carry the weight of history. Broken timbers shifted under their touch, sending small clouds of silt swirling through the water. Visibility was poor, and every movement had to be deliberate. The cold of the lake was biting, even through the thick wetsuits and gloves, but the divers barely noticed. Their focus was entirely on the wrecks below, the shapes that had been locked in the lake for over a century, and the possibility that gold could still be hidden among the debris. Each sweep of the flashlight revealed fragments of the ship's past lives, splintered planks, rusted metal fittings, twisted ropes, and yet hints of treasure began to appear in subtle ways. Mike's light caught something that glimmered faintly in the muddy water. He signaled to John, and they moved closer. A cluster of objects, smooth and round, sat partially buried in silt. At first glance, they appeared to be stones, but their unusual weight and subtle sheen suggested something more. Carefully, they brushed away layers of sediment, revealing small gold coins and fragments of jewelry. The excitement was instant, but measured. They had found the first tangible evidence that the legendary treasure was real. Every piece they uncovered told a story of sudden disaster, hurried attempts to save cargo, and the final resting place of a fortune that had eluded treasure hunters for generations. Back on the boat, the crew erupted with excitement when the divers reported the discovery.
Rick's hands trembled slightly as he listened, a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration on his face. He had spent decades chasing legends, studying old accounts, and putting together pieces of historical puzzles. But now, seeing proof emerge from the lake's dark depths was overwhelming. For him, this was the moment when myth met reality. The story of the Confederate gold, lost for so long, was no longer just a tale told around campfires. It was real, and it was unfolding before them, piece by piece. The divers continued their careful exploration, moving toward the smaller wreck. This ship was in slightly better condition than the larger one, but still heavily damaged. It had clearly sunk in haste, likely during a storm that had overtaken the crew while they were attempting to recover the treasure from the first ship. Twisted beams and broken railings crisscrossed the deck, forming a dangerous maze that the divers had to navigate. Every step was a test of skill and patience. The cold of the lake, combined with the weight of their equipment and the instability of the wreck, made even the smallest movements exhausting. But the promise of treasure and the thrill of discovery kept them going. As they explored the smaller wreck, more signs of the gold began to emerge. Pieces of containers, some partially open, revealed traces of coins, jewelry, and small bars. The divers carefully recorded each find, taking photos and noting exact locations. These early discoveries were critical, not just for the potential value of the gold, but for understanding how the ships had sunk and how the treasure had been dispersed. Every artifact told a story: hurried attempts to save cargo, the sudden impact of waves, and the icy grip of the lake claiming its victims. On the surface, the tension was almost unbearable. Rick and the crew monitored every movement, every description, hanging on to every word from Mike and John,
Constantly updated. And as the divers moved, shadows and shapes shifted across the screen, revealing details that had been hidden for decades. The crew worked in silence for the most part, understanding that any distraction could be dangerous. Even the smallest mistake underwater could ruin an artifact or injure a diver. The balance between caution and excitement was delicate, and everyone knew it. Hours passed, and the divers continued to uncover pieces of the wrecks, slowly piecing together a picture of what had happened. The larger ship, with its shattered hull, had been completely overwhelmed by the storm. Evidence suggested that the crew had tried to jettison cargo to stay afloat, but the waves and wind were too powerful. The smaller vessel, which came years later in an attempt to salvage the treasure, had suffered a similar fate. Its remains rested atop the larger wreck in a tragic overlay, as if the lake itself had decided to guard the fortune fiercely. The sonar images confirmed the divers' findings, showing the overlapping wrecks and the scattered remains of cargo in precise detail. But the real breakthrough came when the divers noticed something unusual near the bow of the larger wreck. A cluster of objects, heavier and denser than anything else around, seemed to be partially buried in silt. Carefully, they cleared away layers of debris and sediment. As the shapes became clearer, the divers realized they were looking at larger gold bars, still intact after more than a century underwater. The weight, the arrangement, and the density were unmistakable. This was not a small find. This was a significant portion of the treasure, almost exactly what the legend had promised. Excitement on the boat escalated. Rick could hardly contain himself. Years of research, planning, and risk-taking were finally paying off. The gold was real, and it was in front of them. He watched the monitors, saw the divers' lights sweep across the glimmering metal, and felt the adrenaline surge. This was the kind of moment that historians and treasure hunters dream about for a lifetime. The story of Poverty Island, once dismissed as folklore, was now a tangible, living history, and every piece of gold recovered was more than just wealth. It was a connection to a past filled with daring, desperation, and human ambition. The divers continued methodically, taking time to document and secure each piece.
The careful approach was necessary. The wrecks were fragile, and one wrong move could send decades of sediment and debris tumbling over the treasure. The divers had to balance speed with precision, a challenging task when the cold darkness and physical strain were constant companions. But with every new bar, coin, or artifact brought into view, the scope of the find became clearer. The treasure was extensive, far exceeding initial expectations, and its condition was remarkable considering how long it had been underwater. Meanwhile, back on the boat, Rick and the crew began preparing for the next phase of the operation. The gold recovered during these initial dives had to be carefully lifted and transported to the surface, documented and protected. They coordinated plans for subsequent dives, mapped the location of key artifacts, and discussed how to approach deeper sections of the wrecks without disturbing the surrounding debris. Every decision mattered. One misstep could destroy not only a piece of history, but also the possibility of uncovering more of the lost fortune.
Sunrise, the lake smooth and almost eerily calm. The quiet reflected the seriousness of the mission. Everyone knew that what they were attempting could change the course of their lives, not just financially, but historically. Rick was already on deck going over the dive plan for the day. They would focus on deeper sections of both wrecks, areas that had not been fully explored during the initial dives. These sections were tricky, covered in thick sediment, and the wreckage was more unstable than they had encountered before. But the promise of gold was too great to ignore, and the team was ready. Mike and John prepared to dive once again, double-checking every piece of equipment. Their air tanks, communication lines, and lights were inspected meticulously. Even the smallest failure underwater could have severe consequences, and both divers understood the risk. The cold water of Lake Michigan was unforgiving, and fatigue set in quickly when working at depth. Still, the thought of $4 million in gold waiting beneath the waves was an incredible motivator. Every ounce of effort was worth it if they could locate even a fraction of the treasure. As they descended, the murky water closed around them like a curtain. Their lights pierced through the darkness, revealing twisted metal, broken timbers, and silt-covered artifacts. Each sweep of the beam uncovered more clues about the history of the ships. The larger wreck, partially buried under the weight of the smaller ship, was difficult to navigate. Planks and beams formed sharp angles, creating a maze that required careful maneuvering. Any sudden movement could destabilize the wreck and send debris falling onto precious artifacts. The divers had to be cautious, moving deliberately while also trying to cover as much area as possible. It wasn't long before they found more pieces of the puzzle. Near the stern of the larger ship, Mike spotted a metallic glint through the silt. Carefully, he brushed away layers of mud, revealing the edge of a gold bar. His heart raced as he signaled John. This was the real treasure, not just small artifacts, but something that represented significant value. They continued to clear the surrounding area, uncovering several more bars, all stacked in a small, waterlogged crate. The positioning suggested that the crew of the ship had attempted to secure the gold during the storm, only to be overcome by the waves. Back on the surface, the team watched the divers' progress with growing excitement. Rick's hands shook slightly as he observed the images and listened to the updates. Years of planning, research, and patience were finally paying off. The gold was real, and it was tangible. For decades, people had dismissed the story as legend, but now evidence lay before them. Every new discovery reinforced the idea that this treasure had survived time and elements, waiting for someone determined enough to find it.
Behind when the storm struck. The scale of the find began to become apparent. What had started as a rumor about a single ship now involved 2 wrecks, both contributing to a staggering potential haul. The divers carefully documented every location, taking photos and video for future analysis. Each piece of gold, each artifact, and each section of the wrecks provided valuable information about how the treasure had been stored, moved, and ultimately lost. The depth of history in this site was astonishing. Every dive felt like stepping back in time, witnessing the final moments of desperate crews who had risked everything for wealth and survival. Meanwhile, the team on the surface prepared to lift some of the recovered gold to safety. Specialized containers were lowered into the water, and the divers carefully placed the bars inside, securing them for transport to the boat. The process was slow and methodical, but necessary. Any mistake could damage the gold or endanger the divers. Once the first load was safely on board, the crew began tallying and inspecting the findings. The bars were heavier than expected, the coins older and more valuable than anyone had imagined. The excitement was palpable, but everyone remained focused, knowing that more treasure could still lie in deeper, less accessible areas. Hours passed, and the divers continued their work, moving systematically through both wrecks. They discovered additional gold hidden under layers of silt and debris. Some pieces had shifted over time, while others remained exactly where they had been placed more than a century ago. The preservation was remarkable, and it became clear that this site was more than just a lost treasure. It was a time capsule, preserving the history of a dramatic and tragic chapter in maritime history. Every discovery added context, telling the story of two ships, two crews, and a fortune lost to the lake. As the day progressed, the divers reported another astonishing find. Buried under a thick layer of sediment near the bow of the smaller wreck was a small chest, partially crushed but still intact. The lid was cracked open just enough to reveal a collection of gold coins, their surfaces glinting faintly in the divers' lights. Carefully, they lifted the chest and secured it, documenting the find for future analysis. This was a remarkable piece of the puzzle, confirming that the legendary treasure had not only existed but had survived decades underwater. The condition of the coins and bars suggested careful handling by the original crews, preserving them from total destruction. On the boat, the crew began to grasp the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The combined gold from both wrecks, along with smaller artifacts and coins, represented a staggering sum. It was more than just wealth. It was a tangible connection to the past, a piece of history that had been hidden beneath the lake for generations. Rick's long-held belief in the story was vindicated, and the team felt a mix of exhilaration, relief, and awe. Even as the sun began to set, the divers continued their meticulous work. The deeper they went, the more gold found. Some pieces required careful extraction, while others were embedded in the wreckage, challenging their skills and patience. But the thrill of discovery, the tangible proof of legend turning into reality, drove them forward. Every successful recovery reinforced the idea that this site was one of the most significant underwater treasure finds of the modern era. By the end of the day, the team had brought multiple loads of gold to the surface. The value was already in the millions, and the full extent of the treasure remained to be uncovered. Each bar, coin, and artifact was carefully cataloged and secured. The divers returned exhausted but satisfied, knowing that their careful approach had preserved the integrity of the site while revealing its incredible secrets. Rick looked out over the calm lake as the boat began its slow journey back to shore. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the water, and he reflected on the decades of research, patience, and risk-taking that had led to this moment. The legend of Poverty Island, once dismissed as a story, had become reality. And the $4 million in lost shipwreck gold, now partially recovered, was proof that perseverance and belief could turn myth into fact. The following morning, the team returned to the site with renewed focus. After the excitement of the initial finds, everyone understood that the most significant discoveries were likely still hidden deeper within the wrecks. The divers geared up early, their movements precise and efficient. Mike and John reviewed the dive plan once more, mapping their route carefully. They knew that the deeper they went, the more dangerous the wrecks would become. Shifting debris, trapped silt, and unstable timbers meant that one wrong move could destroy both artifacts and gold, or worse, endanger their lives. Still, the thrill of uncovering history and treasure outweighed the risks. As they descended, the water felt even colder than before. The divers' lights cut through the darkness, illuminating jagged edges of wood, rusted metal fittings, and layers of silt that had